Today we have a tremendous opportunity, one of our own. We count Dr. Jared Bigham as one of our own. For years he served as a principal at high school and at our what we call our Ducktown site. And he was not just a good principal there, but he was a friend to Lincoln Memorial University and all of our faculty, and he was so supportive of our programming there. So we count him really as one of our School of Education. It's like we hope you feel, Jared, that you've come home today. Let me just mention a few things about him. Dr. Jared Bigham oversees the support for the successful implementation of Tennessee's sweeping reforms, focusing on preparing students for success beyond high school, specifically through Tennessee's Common Core state standards. Before joining SCORE, which we're a supporter of as a School of Education, Jared was supervising principal of Copper Basin Schools in Polk County, Tennessee. He taught elementary, language arts, and middle school science. He serves now on Tennessee's Common Core Leadership Council, and he is the former executive director of the Tennessee Rural Education Association, of which he is a current board member. Jared's a graduate of Lee University and went on to receive a master's in curriculum instruction from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and a doctorate degree in educational leadership from Liberty University. And I've had an opportunity to serve on an advisory council chaired by Jared, and I call him, I don't say Dr. Bigham, I call him Jared, yes, because he's our friend. But let me tell you, here's a man who cares about education in Tennessee. He gives his best effort to making sure that we're moving forward in the right direction. And it's a privilege to see him work so hard to make good things happen for our students throughout the state. This is a good time for us to talk about what's happening in Tennessee, all the changes. And as you know, this lecture series is given in honor of Dr. Fred Bedell, who for years served as an exemplary dean of the School of Education. And by the way, I hear Dr. Bedell is doing fine. He seems to be recovering from his surgery, and we saw him at our recent advisory council meeting, and I know he'd be here today if he had the opportunity. But again, let's give a good welcome to Dr. Jared Bigham, our lecture series speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Clyburn. Somebody neglected to put on the bio that my EDS was from Lincoln Memorial University. And my cohort professors were Dr. Swantick and Dr. Standifer, who I am depressed to hear is retiring at the age of 55. I don't know why she would want to do that at such a young age, but I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the LMU program with Dr. Swannick, Dr. Standifer, because it was a reality check and a very practical degree program that, you know, I just finished up at University of Tennessee, and I'd been teaching for a year, not 2 years, and there was a lot of theory at the University of Tennessee that I found didn't quite transfer to the reality of the classrooms once I got there. So I appreciated the practical sense that that the LMU program provides for teachers. And then as I had the opportunity to teach some classes this past year for LMU, so being a part of that and seeing educators grow and be able to use something in their classroom, I think is one of the benefits of an LMU program. So I'm going to miss seeing Dr. Standifer at LMU events, and but I definitely wish her the best, and I'm happy for her that she's getting retired at such a young age. When I was asked to talk about the landscape in Tennessee, I started thinking, man, there is so much to talk about. So I like to always start with this analogy when I talk about Ed.D reform and what's going on in the state. And it's about this guy who his car broke down on the side of the road on this old country road. So he walks this nearby farmhouse and asks farmer if he could use his phone, call a tow truck. Yeah, no problem. He said, "Here, won't you wait on the porch and have a glass of tea while we're waiting on the tow truck to get here?" So they're sitting there talking, and this pig comes walking around the front of the house, and it's got a wooden leg. And the man says, my goodness, I've never seen a pig with a wooden leg. And the farmer said, oh, this extraordinary pig. This pig is unreal. He said, one time I was working on my tractor, and the pig was there, and the tractor fell on me, had me pinned down, and I was hurt bad, and the pig went and got my wife, and my wife was able to come and help me and get me out of from under the tractor in the accident. And the man said, oh, he said, that's how the pig lost his leg. He said he got hurt when the tractor fell. And the man said, oh, no. He said, son, you don't understand. This pig is unreal. He said, one time the barn caught on fire. And the pig came squealing at the house till finally got my attention. And I went around and saw the barns on fire, and I was able to put it out before we lost everything. And the man said, oh, the pig got hurt when the barn caught on fire. He said, no, son, you're not listening. This is an extraordinary pig. He said, one time had some burglars trying to break in the house. And that pig came up on the porch, started squealing till it woke me up, and I came down to see what was going on, and it scared the burglars off. And the man said, oh, I get it. The burglars hurt the pig when he started squealing. He said, son, he said, you're not listening to me. He said, a pig this extraordinary, you can't eat all at once. So when I talk about the education reforms going on in Tennessee, I say that you can't give just a whole picture and point to one thing. There's about a dozen different little bites of what's going on in our state that all kind of make up a compilation of the progress we're making in K-12 and in higher ed. So keep that in mind as we go along. I've got a smattering of about 5 different presentations I get that I've pulled from to give you an update what's going on in our public schools and some of our higher ed partnerships, and what's going on, a legislative update that you're probably interested to hear, about Common Core standards, where that stands with our representatives, and park assessment is a hot topic this week in our legislature. So I get the privilege and honor of dealing with policymakers as well in my job during session. So I'll give you an update on that as well. But I want this to be very informal, so as I go along and I'm talking about these different things, if you've got a question, raise your hand, holler out, throw something at me, get my attention, and I definitely want this to be informative and practical for you as we go along. And speaking of the higher ed partnerships, what we're finding across the state is that we've got some silos of success where we're really seeing in our rural districts some growth like we've never had before. And where those silos of success are occurring is where there's great partnerships between K-12 and higher ed. And LMU is one of the state leaders, if you didn't know that, in these partnerships, one with the Clinch-Powell Rural Collaborative in Northeast Tennessee, and then the Tennessee Valley Learning Network, the TVLN group, in Southeast Tennessee that I'm a part of, that I'm still pretty active with, that combines Monroe, Polk, Marion, Sweetwater City, Cleveland City, and Bradley County schools. And we've got a great partnership with LMU and Lee University in that area, where we have a leadership program that they can start in through some training we're doing on-site and at an area where we facilitate 2 days a month for some training, and they get credit with LMU to begin their program if they want to. And we just found out last week, it looks like we're going to be able to get an extension on that grant and continue with an aspiring leadership cohort and an instructional facilitator cohort. And so we hope to continue that partnership with LMU to get people a little boost into their graduate program. So appreciate the work that LMU is doing in partnering with these rural districts. And the work, some of you probably know Alan Pratt. He's a former East Tennessee Corps Director. He's one of my buddies, go way back, and just so you know, he is a great representative out there for Lincoln Memorial and spreading the gospel of higher ed partnerships with rural education. So That's my promotional plug on making sure we keep that connection with K-12. And then we're going to get into taking some bites of the pig here. Why I do what I do, these 10-year-old twins right here of mine, 4th grade this year. So when I go to speak somewhere, whenever whether it's promoting Common Core, whether it's professional development I do in districts, or if I'm talking to a policymaker, I'm wearing a daddy hat 24/7. And so just so to give you some perspective, no, it's not just about a reformist mentality for me. It's about what these kind of educational experience these two kids are going to have for the next 8 years, and then the next 8 years after that in post-secondary. Because my kids will tell you pretty quickly that I don't pressure them about their college career. They'll say, Daddy's going to let us get a doctorate degree in anything we want to. So just know that this isn't just about professional me. This work we do is very personal for me. And I find that educators who are very dedicated to this profession in higher ed and public ed are called to this work. And this work is, I really feel like it is a calling and not a career if you're passionate about it. So, that's my bragging on my kids, Cade and Malia. I want to set the scene for you a little bit on how we got to where we are as a state, why we are implementing some of the reforms we're implementing, and a lot of it's for economic reasons. Right now, in the United States, there's 3 million jobs we can't fill because of a lack of a skilled workforce. In Tennessee, in the tech manufacturing industry, there are 2 openings for every 1 applicant. Now, what that tells us is when we hear these numbers, we hear these dismal numbers about unemployment, and like my county, Polk County, unemployment stays in the teens pretty consistently. And people have the misconception that means that there's not jobs out there that people can get, when in reality a good part of it is that they don't have the skill sets to get the jobs that are available. And in our state, 80% of the jobs require some kind of post-secondary training. Now that doesn't necessarily mean a 4-year degree. It can mean an industrial certification through a 6-month program, 12-month program. But there's still some kind of post-secondary requirement for most of the jobs in our state right now. And one thing that's irritating to me is I irritated at myself because I used to say the same thing. I'd say, there's jobs out there. I see help wanted signs all the time. I see help wanted signs at gas stations. I see them at McDonald's. If somebody really wanted a job, they could get one. That's true. But those jobs don't pay a livable wage. Those jobs won't support a family getting insurance for a car, paying a mortgage, buying the organic groceries at the grocery store for your kids. So if a Tennessean wants a job that makes a livable wage, most of those jobs are going to require some kind of post-secondary certification or degree. And we're only 1 generation removed from that. So that's the problem. We're in a paradigm shift culturally in our state because, especially in rural communities, you had industries, you had, or mining, or whatever, like my area is mining, and I know near Harrogate area, you're getting close to Kentucky, mining was a big industry, where that people 1 generation ago could drop out of school and make more money in their community as a high school dropout working in the mines or working in some manufacturing plant than they could with a 4-year degree. A miner in my community in the 50s made $60,000 a year on average. In the 50s, we had a very high upper middle class community in Ducktown, Tennessee. We had a private airport. We had a country club, a 9-hole golf course country club in Ducktown, Tennessee, because of the mining industry. And these young boys were dropping out of school left and right at 17, 16, because they could go work in the mines or they could work on a labor gang and make a very good living. Well, in 1988, when the copper mines closed, there's no industry in Ducktown left. And so if these people want a middle-income job, they have to commute and they have to have a degree of some kind, because I promise you, places like Volkswagen aren't going to save us like we thought they were. As a high school principal, when Volkswagen came, I thought, man, this is it. This is going to help me out so much. I'm not going to have to push all these kids to go to college. I'm not going to have to push them to go to trade school. They're going to be able to go down to Volkswagen and put cars together, and they're going to make good money, and they're going to get good benefits, and they're going to get a lease on one of those little Jettas, and they're going to be happy. It doesn't work like that. Robots put the cars together. They want people with a skill set that can maintain the robots that put the cars together. There's 64 different jobs at Volkswagen, and about 63 of them require some kind of training or certification. So as a principal, I had to take a hard look at what I was doing to prepare kids for life after high school, because industry isn't the salvation. Some kind of education after high school is the salvation, but preparing them for that was where we were failing kids in our state. We need to talk about truth in advertising and perceptions a little bit, because most of you know No Child Left Behind unless you've been living under a rock. Well, when No Child Left Behind came along, and we're going to raise the standards for everybody, and by this year, if you remember 2014, it seemed like a long time ago, because I remember I was maybe a first-year principal at elementary school or something, I can't remember, but I just remember thinking by 2014 we've got to have 100% of our kids graduating. We've got to have 100% of them passing all of our assessments. In Tennessee, I don't know if you remember this or not, but we were the national leader in setting the high standards. We said, you know what, before we consider ourselves successful, we want 80-some-odd%, it's like 88%, 85% of our kids to pass our state-created assessments. And nationally, people say, wow, look at Tennessee. They've set that bar so high. And we were meeting it. We were having 80-something% of our kids pass our achievement tests in elementary school, middle school. They were passing our end-of-course exams in high school. But what we weren't telling people is that our state-created assessments were pitifully easy, and the cut scores that you had to make to pass those assessments were embarrassingly low. You only had to get about 50% of the questions right in order to be considered proficient. So this same almost 90% of students that we were saying were ready for life after high school, based on our state-created assessments and our state standards, when they took a national assessment that gauged their college and career readiness, only 16% were scoring high enough to not take remedial classes in college. 16%. So I like to flip that and say 84% of our kids were not prepared for life after high school through our current system of education around 2007, 8, 9. Even though we were being touted nationally as really setting the bar high. And so it's all about perceptions and the perceptions people get from the rhetoric and what you see. And I've got a great story, personal story, that talks about perception and how we use it sometimes to our benefit, but ultimately it's going to come back to bite you. When my first year as elementary principal at Copper Basin Elementary, they were dragging the bottom of the barrel, and I was like 26, 27 years old, I think, and so they thrust me into this position. I didn't know what I was doing, even though I did have superior training from Dr. Standifer and Dr. Swanek. You know, there's still you walk into that principalship and there's a lot of reality that hits you in the face through parents and everything else. But I hadn't been on the job 2 months when we had a water leak somewhere on campus. Water company comes and said, you're losing hundreds of thousands of gallons a month, and you need to find this leak. So we looked all over, couldn't find it. We had to bring an expert in from somewhere in Georgia to go around with this special little listening device, and found out it was actually under the floor in the hallways. That for whatever reason, whatever genius designed the school, the water lines ran directly under the hall floors, under concrete. So we're going to have to put in a new water line system. And we're going to have to run it through the ceiling, do all this other stuff. So we were out of school for a week during this time. And I hired a couple guys that I'd gone to school with. It's 2 brothers, Nathan and Neil Picklesheimer. Just good old boys. And they had a company called Pix Plumbing. And so Nathan and Neil, they were they knew plumbing and they were working it and they were working hard. But I made the mistake of when Channel 3 News called me and said, how's it going up there? I said, I said, we hate to be out of school. And they said, yeah, that's why we know you guys have been out of school 2 days already. What's it looking like? I said, well, it looks like maybe a week. I said, we're working 24/7 on this to try to get, the old people there 24/7. And I just kind of said that flippantly. And so that gets out there that they're working 24/7, get these kids back in school. And so then Channel 9 calls me up at the house about 6:30 one night in our 3rd day of this and says, hey, we know you guys are working 24/7. We want to send a camera crew up there to video the work going on. And so because we think that whatever we're working on this. So I thought, well, and to be honest, they were working about 12 hours a day. These, Nathan, Neil, they were hammering down. So I called them up and I said, hey, where are y'all at? I said, well, we're here at Hardee's grabbing dinner. And I said, well, I'll meet y'all back over to school. I said, there's a camera crew coming up. And they said, oh, we're not working anymore today. And I said, why not? I said, well, we need some pipe. We don't have a certain kind of pipe, and we're going to have to get it tomorrow when they open. I said, no. Y'all got to go back over there, and you got to work on something because the camera crew is coming. So we go over, and I'm there, and camera crew gets there, and they're Nathan and Neil just walking up down that hall, and they're carrying pipes on their shoulders, and they're sawing pipes, and I wish I'd saved some of the footage because it's got them down, and they've cut out a hole in one wall, and the camera's on one side and they're on the other, and they're putting pipe up through there that they have to take out later and all this stuff. And I do an hour and a half of interviews, videotaped interviews. I'm going through classrooms, and I'm talking very eloquently and I think very profoundly. And I'm using all these communication skills that Lincoln Memorial taught me. And at the end of the day, at one point, they said, well, how do you think this affects teachers and students? You've missed a week of school. And I kind of slipped back into my rural colloquialisms, and I said, well, sometimes you just got to cowboy up and do what you got to do. That night on the news, guess what clip out of the hour and a half they show Pix Plumbing running up and down the hall, sweat's pouring out of it, and then they say, and Principal Jared Bigham had this to say about the situation. Sometimes you got to cowboy up and do what you got to do. That's it. So I learned 2 valuable lessons about perception. One, you can mold it to meet your needs, but you can also look like an idiot too in that process. And so that's what Tennessee did. We molded it to make us look good, but it came back to bite us later. Here's some sobering statistics for you. For every 100 ninth graders on average in our state who start as ninth graders as a cohort together, 87 of them will graduate. Of those 87, 59 enroll in some kind of public post-secondary institution. Of those 59, 43% finish some kind of degree program or certification within 6 years. 49%. So that's about roughly 20 out of 100 will finish some kind of degree program. And if we think back to my earlier statistic that 80% of the jobs in Tennessee require some kind of post-secondary certification, we've got our numbers flipped somewhere, people. We're doing something wrong with our students somewhere. Right now, in junior colleges, they did a study in our state that if a student has to take just one remedial class in a junior college, only 5% of those students actually finish some kind of degree or certification. So a lot of what we have been doing in this state, I call educational malpractice, because we've been telling students, we've been telling teachers, parents, higher ed, business leaders that kids are prepared for life after high school, and they haven't been. Good news, though, we have implemented some reforms in our state, and I'll talk about those reforms in a minute, but I wanted to sprinkle in some good news. Most of you know what the NAEP assessment is. It's our national report card that compares 4th and 8th graders. And since we've started some of these reforms in 2009, 2010, we have seen some great success. And NAEP, again, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you heard back in the fall of the gains Tennessee made, historic gains from 2011 to 2013. We actually increased our NAEP scores by almost 22 points, which is a record in the history of NAEP. The next closest state you see to us, Indiana, with 14 points. So what we're doing is working, but it's not one thing. Some people like to say, well, it's Common Core standards, or it's this, or it's that. No. It's a compilation of several things that we're doing, and we'll talk a little bit about today. But I wanted to give some good news at the front in the midst of all the sobering statistics, so you'll know that there's light at the end of the tunnel here. And this, real quickly, you can see where we jumped. In 4th grade reading, we went from 41st to 31st. In math, 46th, 37th. In reading, 41st, 34th, and 45th, 43rd in 8th grade math. That's a pretty significant jump in 2 years. And our hope, honestly, is that we're going to be in the 20s, mid-20s, this next assessment in 2015. I really believe, if I'm placing a Vegas bet, I believe we'll be there. Now, poor old Rachel's going to have to sit through my buzzwords presentation again, but I was asked to come to the P16 Council in East Tennessee yesterday and talk about buzzwords in education, which fits perfectly what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to include some of the major initiatives that are out there. And what I found is even in K-12 public educators, we use a lot of these terms and these programs are out there, but they still don't have a real clear understanding, even though they're knee-deep in the work. And so I find that it's even harder for higher ed folks sometimes, unless they really proactively do some research on their own, or they're in the districts a lot, that they hear these words and about these programs, but they may not have a lot of clarity of the impact they're making or what they're about. So I thought it would be great to go through some buzzwords in education. And everybody was using bees yesterday, and I wanted to be different because I've got 10-year-old twins and we're a Disney house, so I've got Buzz from Toy Story up there. So here we go. Common Core state standards. That's been a hot button topic, and there's still a lack of understanding, I think, of where these standards came from, how they were developed, how they were implemented in Tennessee, why we got them in Tennessee. So I'll spend just a couple minutes talking about that, but just when I think that the public is informed or the educators are informed, something will happen to remind me that there's a lot of rhetoric out there that people don't understand, or they, whatever their sources are, if they don't have the right sources, they're going to believe what they hear. And literally, last week I was having my taxes done, and this lady that's wonderful, has been doing my taxes forever. She said, I want to know when you're going to come back to Polk County. I'm tired of seeing these W-2s of other organizations and outside this county. I want you back in Polk County and being administrator. And I said, well, I appreciate that. That makes me feel good. And she said, and another thing, I want you back here to get rid of this Common Core thing that they're talking about all the time. I was like, oops. So there's still, I think some misconceptions out there. So I'll give you the 1 minute historical narrative of where Common Core came from. In mid-2000s, the first discussions about Common Core occurred with the National Governors Association. When they said, I imagine them in my mind sitting around smoking cigars and sipping on scotch or something in one of these libraries talking about all the politics of the nation and movers and shakers or whatever. But at some point, somebody said, why do you have different standards than my state, but you say your kids are college and career ready, and then over there in California, they say their kids are college and career ready. Arkansas says it, but we've all either got different standards, or we teach them at different times, or we use different materials and resources. So how can we all say we have these standards, but we're all doing something different? Isn't there some commonality we could agree on, that there's a basic skill set, that there's a floor somewhere we can have some minimum expectations that all students should have at each grade level? And so that's how the conversation started. And the reality check for me on that is a principal in Ducktown. How many have you been to the Ducktown campus or been through Copper Hill or where? Well, you know that you can throw a rock and hit Georgia 3 miles away and North Carolina 5 miles away. We're right in the corner of the state. And so we're a very transient community right in there of kids going from North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and families moving. And so it honestly depended on the time of year, the grade level, as to whether those students would be ahead of my students or the state, which state they were coming from, if they would be behind my students, if they wouldn't even be in the same universe as my students. And that was when the light started going off for me, even before we were talking about Common Core, is how can 3 states right beside each other have such differences in standards and when things are taught, even at the same grade level? We were teaching stuff at the end of the year, they were teaching at the beginning of the year or the middle of the year. So as a practitioner, I saw that firsthand, how having some agreement as to common skill set and a common body of knowledge as a base to operate from was important. So the National Governors Association got with the chief state school officers, which are like our Commissioner of Education, and they agreed to develop these standards as that floor. That's what you need to keep in mind. These are minimum expectations at each grade level. They're the floor, not the ceiling. And so they're not the be-all to end-all of what a student should know. They're the minimum expectations for that grade level to prepare them for the next grade level. And that's the difference in Common Core standards and the way we've done things in Tennessee and many other states were doing, is we didn't have a real linear progression. We had a smattering of this, that, and the other. We memorized a lot of skills. We had over 100 standards in each grade or each subject area starting in 3rd grade. Think about that. How many of you are practitioners or former practitioners that taught elementary school? Anybody in here? So you know what a daunting task that was to try to cover 100 standards plus in math, in language arts, in social studies, in science. Honestly, what did we end up doing with social studies and science in elementary? That was relegated to like what craft time used to be. We don't get to do that anymore. It was memorize as much as possible, and if a kid couldn't catch up, stay up, sorry. We got to cover these SPIs. And by George, those SPIs better be on the board, hadn't they, when the principal walks in. So, Common Core standards build on each other, whether there's 25 to 40 standards at each grade level that prepare you for the next grade level, so that there's not a lot of overlap. It really does make sure that if you've got these minimum expectations, when you leave third grade, you're going to be ready for fourth grade. Park assessment. Anybody have any questions on Common Core before we move on to assessing it? Okay. I'll talk about the legislative update. Well, it's probably a good time. Common Core from a legislative standpoint seems like it's pretty secure. There's about a week left in our legislative sessions. I think the plan now is to close out by next week. And there's no bills right now to do anything adversely to Common Core. The House passed a delay bill that you may have heard about 3 weeks ago that said we would delay any future or any further implementation of Common Core standards and a 2-year delay on park assessment. But how that affected Common Core is it said any future implementation. Well, we're already implementing K-12, so it doesn't affect what we're doing already. And there are no science or social studies Common Core standards. Okay, yeah, they're not even, there's no other Common Core standards even under development anywhere. So math and English are it, and we're fully implemented as of this year, K-12. The park assessment, that bill does affect park, and it's still floating around in the Senate now, and they're trying to figure out, well, does it have a fiscal note attached to it in time when it was voted on? Should it go to Senate Finance? Should it go to a different committee? And ultimately, what's going to happen with Park and Common Core, or Park actually, is it's going to go to a committee that's appointed by the Lieutenant Governor will appoint some folks, and the Speaker of the House will appoint some folks, and it's called a conference committee, and they will come out of this conference committee with a recommendation on how to move forward with the park assessment. And there's 3 lines of thinking that are prevailing right now. And in my conversation with policymakers, it's divided pretty equally in about thirds. A third of the folks want to hammer down the park. Let's do it next year, but let's have a hold harmless for teachers that first year on their growth scores. Still have district accountability, but do a hold harmless for teachers. Another third says, well, let's slow down, let's delay park another year, and let's actually do an RFP and bid out our assessment process and see if there's any other companies that might align with what we're doing and make this fair, and we shouldn't just put all our chips apart. So let's give everybody else an opportunity, and we'll delay 1 year and come back. And if Park wins RFP, great, but we'll bid it out. So that's another line of thinking. Then the third line is, well, a lot of districts have spent time, money, and energy in preparing for Park. They've got the infrastructure for Park. So let's let the ones that want to do it, and the other ones do our old achievement test and end the course within the TCAP framework. And and then there's still some out there, like from SCORE's perspective, organizationally, SCORE says, let's stay the course, let's not change anything, let's implement Park as we'd originally planned, and we've been planning for 3 years, and keep moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see. We should know by this time next week where we stand with Park assessment. So let's talk about what Park is. And Park stands for the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness, College, and Career. And the value that we're supposed to find in this assessment, and I think we do find, is twofold. One, it aligns with the way we're teaching in our classrooms. Because what's the point of having a thinking set of standards where we're really promoting the why and the how if we rely on an assessment that only asks students the what? And the PARC assessment goes beyond just multiple choice tests. I mean, there are some multiple choice questions on there, but you have the constructed response questions as well. How many of you are familiar with constructed response questions? And you've seen that, that's a new thing for our educators the past couple of years they've been practicing, where instead of a page with 30 calculations on there that students have to do, there might be 5, and they're like a word problem, but actually go beyond word problems, where a student still might do a calculation in math, but then they're asked to do something with that information, maybe create a graph or a chart, and then actually type an answer as to how they got that answer, or why they used the line of thinking they used, or they might have to type an answer using that information. So it's applying the information versus just getting the right answer. We still want the right answer. That's another misconception I think that's out there, is that, we're more interested in process than making sure kids get right answers. No, it's still, they've got to have the right answer, but then we want them to be able to do something with that once they get it. So on the math side, that's what questions would look like with PARC. On the ELA side, instead of our old, multiple choice, they read a passage and then they have to answer a question they just remember from a story. They may read a story and it says, what color was the little girl's coat in the story? Well, with our old test, they say red. Well, now with the PARC assessment, it may ask that question, then it may say, why was she wearing a coat? Justify your answer. And they have to go back to the text, highlight portions of the text that support their answer. Might have been because of the weather, might have been for protection, camouflage, whatever, and they bring that text over and drag and drop it in a box to support the answer they give. So we're pushing kids to go beyond just the rote memorization and regurgitating facts with these assessments. This, for the first time also, assessments would be fully online. Now there's a paper pencil version for systems that aren't ready to do it online, but this will be the first time that we have state assessments that are online. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. Good question. I'll address your last comment first about the writing assessment breaking down. They did have a huge failure a server overload the first day. After that, smooth sailing as far as I know in most districts. And I'll say that this is going to be bumpy as we go along and we're doing some of these technologies. I know that systems have been field testing PARC past 2 weeks. Have found some glitches in the software and didn't have right browsers and stuff like that. So from the infrastructure standpoint about the $250 million, I'm not sure about that. I don't know, but here's what I tell people, and they say, well, what? We're having to upgrade all our technology and we're having to get broadband in all our schools. Well, the minimum requirements for PARC assessment is 1 computer or 1 device for every 6 students in a school. So 1 out of 6 students, students need to have access of 1 device of some kind. That can be a tablet, laptop, whatever, for for every 6 students. And this could be in the form of a mobile lab, a classroom lab, whatever it may be. But it's a 1-to-6 ratio and high-speed internet. And I tell people, if we aren't moving towards that anyway, in the culture we live in the expectations we live in the economic landscape we live in, then we're doing a disservice to our students anyway. Whether we're doing Park, we're doing Common Core, we're doing Twiddlywinks. We need to have that much technology within our buildings and access to it for our students. We owe them that. We owe them high-speed internet to do research or whatever they want to do in our schools. Kids need to know how to type at an earlier age than we did. You know, David Bigham, my daddy, when I was 15 years old, signed me up for VOE. You remember VOE? And he said, "You're going to learn how to type, son." I said, "Daddy, I don't want," he was my principal. I said, I don't want to do VOE. He said, "You're doing VOE." And so I showed up to class on the first day and I saw that it was myself and 22 other girls in there. And I was like, yes. But beyond that, typing is one of the greatest skills I ever acquired. And this is not typing, okay? We assume that because kids can do this, that they're going to be technologically literate when we do online assessment. That's not the case. So we have to start changing our curriculum to include more technology and access to technology. Okay, RTI squared. How many of you have heard of RTI? All right, RTI squared. Well, this is very personal for me because when I came to the elementary school, and we're high poverty in East Polk County, we had almost 90% free and reduced lunch at the elementary school. And when I was there, we had around 35% students that were either in special ed or in the referral process. 35% of 463 students. And as a first-year administrator, anytime a teacher came to me and said, "I just can't do anything with little Johnny, he's just not keeping up with class, I want to refer him to special ed," I'd say, "Okay." And I'd sign the papers, and I thought, boy, I'm being a teacher advocate. I am supporting my teachers. I'm doing what I need to do as administrator. I'm helping them out. And I remember Daddy in the swing, and we were sitting there talking about the day, and I'd come and I'd brag about what I was doing because I loved getting feedback from him. He was retired at that time, and I liked getting feedback from him and hearing how good I was doing as administrator. And I said, "Oh, I'll tell you what these teachers love. I refer anybody that comes through on my desk. I sign that paper about before it hits my desk." And he said, "Well, that's stupid." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "What's your percentage of students in special ed in your school?" And I said, I don't know. He said, "Well, you look that up and you get back with me on that tomorrow." So next day we're on the porch swing. So I looked that up, Daddy, it's 35%. He said, "Does that number not stand out to you a little bit, son?" And I said, I don't know. He said, "You should not have more than 15% of your students in your school in special education services or in the referral process." He said, "You're giving an easy out for teachers, first of all, who don't want to fool with it, or the ones who do want to fool with it don't have some kind of support system, or they wouldn't be coming to you to refer them. So you're either, one, not supporting your teachers the way you should for interventions in your classroom." I had to go look up what intervention was because nobody was using that term then. Or two, you're allowing them to get away with something they shouldn't be. So this was towards the end of the year, so I spent the summer Googling. This was when, this was about 10 years ago or so. And so I'm Googling, and that was when you just started. That was a fad, to look up stuff. And I looked up intervention, and I looked up all this stuff, and I wanted to do something. I thought the reading is the key. Well, Florida, of all places, was doing this thing called response to intervention I saw on there. And I thought, well, I'm just going to copy all this stuff they're doing, and we're going to do it at Copper Basin Elementary. And so I did. I completely stole their programs, and I made PowerPoints up about it, and I did training with my teachers on it that summer. We went. I was a hero. We went to Pigeon Forge to the Christmas Inn or whatever that is, and we did a 2-3 day retreat, and we learned about this RTI, and we came back and we implemented that son of a gun with fidelity, and in 2 years we went from 35% to 9%. And I had a conversation with someone in my district. We'd actually dropped a little bit too low because we weren't getting fully funded because our percentages weren't. So we'll pretend like the camera's not on right now, but we had to fudge our numbers a little bit just so we could get fully funded because we were doing so good through this program. So Ducktown was doing RTI before RTI was cool, and the state came around a couple of years ago and said, okay, we're going to implement RTI and we're going to mandate it in our elementary schools and our high schools. So it's supposed to be mandated this coming year for elementary schools and middle schools, K-8. And it was supposed to be for high school, but they're going to let high schools do a waiver if they want to. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but you can do a waiver. And RTI squared is response to intervention and instruction, which is Tennessee's slant on RTI, where it's not just about the Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions that are common that most people focus on in RTI, but it's also that Tier 1 original instruction that sets the foundation for what you do beyond that. So there's a big emphasis on, and if you're not familiar with RTI, I'll give you the 30-second overview. There's 3 tiers in it. Tier 1 is your instruction you give to the whole group as a teacher. Tier 2 is for students who, if they have just a little bit of support throughout the week or the day, this isn't even necessarily pull out. This is within the class with a teacher's aide or time the teacher carves out in the class period, whatever. If they've got a little support, they can stay up with their peers on the content. So it's content support. Tier 3 is for students who, even with that Tier 2 support, they can't stay up with their peers, so it's not about the content, it's about skills. So Tier 3 is interventions that involve supporting students in skill deficiencies, usually reading, but we have RTI and math as well. So, but Tennessee's has put a lot of emphasis on that Tier 1, that whole group instruction to make sure we're doing that well, because if we're not doing that well, then how do we know what kind of interventions we need to do or get a true gauge of where our students are? So I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but that's RTI squared and where we're headed with that. It's actually mandated by the state now. Any questions? All right. And again, the purpose of RTI squared is not to make kids special ed eligible, it's to keep them out of special ed. Because this is probably important to know from an administrative standpoint, is that in our old system, if you want to refer a student to special ed, you just had to have some evidence and documentation. The teacher would do some observations, special ed teacher would do some observations, and have a little meeting with principal, we'd sign some forms, boom, you're in special ed, and parent sign, and that's it. Now with RTI squared, they go through a predetermined amount of time in Tier 2, which is usually a couple months minimum. If they're not successful and make progress or at least stay up with their peers in Tier 2, then they're referred to Tier 3, a predetermined amount of time, which is usually 2 to 3 months. And if there's still no progress or at least sustaining where they were, then they're referred to special ed. So it's a much more authentic process to being referred to for special ed services. Balanced assessment. I need to check my time here. All right. Balanced assessment is one of these buzzwords that's out there. You hear it all the time, and it's not, does this stack of tests I got in this hand weigh the same amount as this stack of tests I got in this hand? I can promise you that. It's a little more complex. But some people really feel like that it's the amount of tests you give. And my daddy told me something when I first got into the administration. He said, son, you can't fatten a pig by weighing it every day. And what he meant by that was, don't overtest your kids, and make sure if you're giving an assessment that you're doing something with that data and you're not testing just to test. That you're using your assessment to guide instruction in some way. And that's what balanced assessment is about. It's about having assessment of learning and assessment for learning. And that's a hot item in our K-12 districts right now, statewide. It's one of our initiatives as a state is to make sure we're using assessment data not in punitive ways, as we kind of have in the past, and just for grades, but to guide our instruction. In the past, when I was in school, when you were in school, we take a test, it's for a grade. Take a pop quiz, it's for a grade. We didn't have assessments so the teacher could figure out if their instruction was effective or not. A lot of times, you've got teachers who are proud that they've got a high percentage of kids failing their test. They'll say, oh man, boy, I made a hard test this time. You hear them in teachers' lounge now. I made a hard test. You wouldn't believe 80% of my kids failed that test today. They're not studying worth a flip. They're not doing what they ought to do. And I'm sitting here thinking, no, you're obviously not teaching them the way they need to be taught. So balanced assessment is making sure that on one hand we do have assessments that are summative and that we associate with grading, and we determine where students are in a particular timeline of their academic progress for that year. We have to have that information, but we also, what I think is even more valuable, is assessment for learning, which is formative and ongoing and directs the teacher's instruction more than the punitive nature for the student. It's actually more of an assessment that's useful for the teacher in saying, are my lessons that I'm giving effective? Do I need to change something in my delivery? Do I need to change something in the resources I'm using? Do I need to change something in how I remediate my students? Do I need to go back and completely redo? And they're very informal. They don't have to be even a paper pencil test. At its most basic level, formative assessment is this. If you understand the organelles and how they work in the cell that we just discussed today, give me a thumbs up. If you don't understand it, give me a thumbs down. If you somewhat understand it, give me one sideways. It can be that simple. And we don't do that enough as educators. A lot of times, and I know when I was a science teacher, I just hammer down. Well, I'm going through notes, contents, PowerPoints, and hands-on activities, and I never checked to see if they were getting it. I checked on Fridays when I tested them, and it's too late then. Well, I'll tell you what, I'd be a rock star teacher if I could go back now and know what I know now. Because I look back, I'm embarrassed and shamed and disgraced for some of the stuff that I used to do as a teacher and inflict on students. And then so when I started implementing this in my school, I had teachers, I wanted to see them doing this all the time. I said, I want to see this throughout your lessons. When I'm visiting, I was in classrooms all the time, and so I'd see, well, kids started figuring the system. You know how kids are, so everybody just started doing this. They're like Fonzie, everywhere you go. It's just thumbs up. So then we changed it. We said, all right, and I'll tell you who came up with this, Dr. Craig Green, who was also a LMU grad and an instructor with LMU. he said, we were in a faculty meeting, he said, I'll tell you what I'm doing now. He said, I do a 1 to 5. If you understand it completely, give me a 5. If you don't understand it at all, give me a 1. And then in between your level of understanding. And then he says, if you're a level 5, turn to somebody that's a lower level than you and explain it to them. And so that puts kids on the spot, and they can't just raise 5 and move on to the next thing. That's how simple formative assessment can be at its simplest level. It can be paper pencil tests. It can be go to the computer lab and do a test. But it's what you do with that assessment that makes it formative, what you do with that data. And that brings formative instructional practices, and I think you've been worn out with this probably with Alan Pratt and Joe T. Wood. It's fine. I just cut my phone on to see what the time was, and Joe T.'s called me 3 times. I think most of y'all dealt with Joe T. He's a great guy, and he knows I'm here in a minute, so I don't know why he's calling me in the middle of this, but Joe T. was one that introduced me to formative instructional practices several years ago, and he kept calling it FIP this and FIP, and I thought, I was a pretty smart guy, I thought, and I didn't want to act like I didn't know what FIP was. So I would just go, every time he'd say FIP or FIP, I'd be, yeah, FIP, that's good stuff, that's good stuff. And I'd Google it, and it'd come up with all kinds of stuff. It wasn't trending anywhere, so I finally had to break down. So, all right, what does FIP stand for? So he told me, but formative instructional practices. And that's that other component that I was talking about, a balanced assessment. So when you hear FIP, that's what it's talking about. It's for informing learning and informing instruction. Any kind of assessment you do that informs instruction is FIP. That's that right side component of balanced assessment. Any questions about that? Okay. Differentiated instructional practices. Now, this gets to that tier 1 level. And I use this example with my teachers all the time. Because a classroom is made up of all these little different mindsets and backgrounds and all this stuff. And I would say, think about snowflakes. Every single snowflake on this planet that is falling or has fallen is different. And I'll tell you, as a side note, when I was stealing these images off of different websites and breaking copyright laws and everything, and it is fascinating. It's beautiful, these snowflakes. If you look at these microscopic views of snowflakes, it's unreal. You Google that. Google it now. I know a lot of you are looking at your ESPN Fantasy League right now. Anyway, we'll switch over there to Google. And, I've been in conferences. I know what you do. I was looking at my Masters best ball tournament about half the time yesterday in that P16 meeting, so that's all right. But look at these snowflakes, and it makes you think about our students, because every snowflake is different, and it's combined of 2 elements, oxygen and hydrogen. And the human body is composed of 60 plus elements. So how different is every single student in that classroom? With their backgrounds, with their experiences, with their ability to learn, absorb information, what type of learner are. We can get into gardener stuff. We can get into, there's so many facets to this. And as teachers, what's the easiest thing to do? Who do you teach to? Middle. Teach to the middle. I'm going to focus on that 50%. Well, Tier 1 in Tennessee, we kind of put a flag in the ground. We said, we're not going to do that. We want to teach to the middle, to the low, and that group that never gets pushed, the high. Because and I know you got kids that can walk in that classroom and pass that TCAP on August 8th. And so they don't get our attention a lot of times. And it takes, people ask me, what's the key to differentiated instructional practices? How do you reach all these different kids? Intestinal fortitude, that's how you do it. A lot of guts, and hard work and planning, because that's the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher. It's not that hard to be a good teacher, people. Keep kids busy. That keeps the principal happy. It's not that hard to keep kids busy. Hit the middle, run off worksheets, do the chapter tests, have no discipline problems. You can be a good teacher, but it takes work to be a great teacher. And that's, as higher ed folks that are training our future teachers, I think that's so important to instill that and impart that into them, that to do a good job in this profession will wear you out, mentally and physically. So differentiated instruction is that tier 1 where we're reaching all kids, and I give presentations on it. I did at the LEAD conference and at special ed conference. I give this great warm and fuzzy presentation, but you will find that throughout my hour presentation, I never give them a template on how to do it. I give them some gimmicks and I give some ideas and stuff, but honest to goodness, it's going to change every day, every class, with every kid. So there's no magic formula. I can give you some perspective on it, but it takes a lot of planning work that we don't have time to get into today. But just understand, when we're talking about Tier 1 instruction in Tennessee and that RTI squared, that's what we're talking about. That's what makes our program in Tennessee different than the regular RTI programs in the nation. Now, in closing, here's some of my personal axioms. And this is what I had whenever we had to do our vision statements in the school. And, some of them are like a paragraph long. And whenever you guys, I was up here for NCATE and all these things, they want some very detailed mission statements. Well, the state does too. When we do stuff for the state, in our improvement plans, we got to have like and lifelong learners. Man, everybody loves hearing lifelong learners and all that stuff. I put up one simple statement. And it was in every classroom, is in the office, is it when you walked in our school. Because ultimately, what do we want our kids to do? We want them to be good citizens, and we want them to serve each other, serve their communities, serve their country, serve their families. And so a student's willingness to serve in this world has to be a reflection of our willingness to serve the student. And humble ourselves. And Rachel saw me get choked up about this yesterday, so I'm going to try not to today. But this profession, Cicero said it's a noble profession. There is no more noble profession than education. And so our interactions with students are so impactful beyond just the academics of it. The teacher is the most important thing in that classroom. We can talk about textbooks and resources and iPads and whiteboards and smart boards and all this stuff all day long. But you give me a good teacher and just a piece of chalk and an old chalkboard, and I guarantee you they're going to get the same results as a mediocre teacher with a smart board and a classroom full of laptops and everything else. And supporting those folks is our mandate, and making sure they understand the gravity of this profession and their responsibilities as educators going into it. And I tell people, when I would hire teachers and they would come in and they would interview, I'd say, why do you want to be a teacher? And I heard this a lot, especially at the elementary level. I just love kids. I love kids. And you know what I'd say? Well, you need to go teach Sunday school or open up a daycare, because you need to love the instructional process. It's good. It's great that you love kids, but you better love the instructional process too, or you will get burned out in a hurry. Because some days it's real hard to love those kids, because it's hard to like them some days. But if you love that process, you make exceptions when the kids are getting on your nerves some days. grace for our students is probably the most important allowance we can make for them in instruction with no expectation of anything in return. Because they're going to come in, they're going to be a little hellions some days. They're not going to want to do the work that the teachers set out for them. They could care less about diagramming sentences. They could care less about the quadratic equation because their mom and daddy was fighting all night last night. Or they didn't eat last night. Or they were out, the school system was out for a snow day the day before, so they didn't eat, period, the day before because they're on free and reduced lunch, and if they don't eat at school, they don't eat. And for me, I should have seen this before, but I never thought about it. Alan Pratt's the one that brought this to my eyes about 5 years ago. He used to open up South Pittsburgh High School on snow days because there were some kids wouldn't eat if that school wasn't open. So kids are being hellions, and they are caring less about the homework assignments that you're given or that the teacher's given. It's that grace component that's going to make the difference. And finally, the work we're doing here in this state is legacy work. The work in that classroom every day, whether it's kindergarten, middle school, or AP English in high school, it's legacy work of some kind. And if people don't view it that way, if educators don't view it that way, if principals don't view it that way, then they're probably in the wrong profession, because there is no other profession on this planet that has more influence over young people, maybe with the exception of the faith-based community. And I've done a lot of study on calling versus career. My dissertation was on calling and educators who were called to the profession. I did a lot of interviews and a qualitative study on this. And the calling aspect for educators who feel like they were called to this profession is equivalent to the calling that missionaries feel to their work. So, at the end of the day, it's not about NAEP scores, it's not about ACT scores, it's not even about our economic landscape. All that stuff takes care of itself when we're supporting those kids in a desk, in a classroom somewhere. And that's what I tell policymakers when I meet with them. The decision, have the mindset that the decision you make here in Nashville affects a kid somewhere in a desk. Don't look at it globally. Don't even look at it at a district level. Think about a kid in a desk, in a classroom. And I'm going to end on a story about service. Some of you have heard me tell this story, so try not to get emotional while I'm telling it so I can get through it. This is a true story. Let me take a minute. There's a man driving down a country road. Came to a house, had a sign in front of the house. Said, "Talking dog for sale, $50. So he went up that door and he said, "I saw your sign out here and I've just got to ask, what's the joke or what's the gimmick?" And the man said, "Oh, I've really got a talking dog out back for sale, $50. And the man said, "Well, I just got to see this." He said, "Well, sure, go on back. He's in the dog lot. Just help." So man walks around behind the house, opens the dog lot up. Sure enough, this golden lab comes bounding up and says, "Hey, how are you?" Keep in mind, it's a true story. And the man says, "I can't believe this. You really are a talking dog." He said, "Tell me how this came about. What's going on here?" And the dog said, "Well, I used to work for the CIA because I've got a servant's heart. and I'm a patriot. And I would go on these diplomatic trips overseas, and I would be in the room with our ambassadors and our diplomats, and I would be in these secret behind closed door meetings, and then when our diplomats and ambassadors would leave the room, I'd stay and I'd listen to what the other countries, their leaders were talking about, and then I'd go back and report it to the CIA. And the man said, wow, that's amazing. I can't believe that. And the dog said, yeah, but he said, that's pretty stressful. So I decided I still wanted to serve in some ways. I got a servant's heart. So I went to work for airport security here in the United States. And I'd go up and down the terminals, and I'd listen to any illegal activity, or if I smelled any illegal substances, I'd tell security about it. And the man said, oh, my goodness. He said, yeah, I know. He said, but he said that even that was stressful on me, but I still wanted to serve. He said, the dog said, because that's what it's about, service and giving back. So he said, so I came to this little rural community here. And 5 miles down the road, there's a playground. And every day I run down to that playground. And I find a child who doesn't have a friend. And I befriend them. And I talk to them. I give them somebody that they can feel like is a companion, that they're not alone in this world. And the man said, wow, that's unbelievable. You really do have a servant's heart. And the dog said, yeah, I know, I'm pretty great. He said, matter of fact, I've got to run down there right now. If you'll just open up the gate, I need to get down to the park. And the man said, well, no, hold on, don't go anywhere just yet. Just wait right here. So he goes back in the house and he tells the guy, he said, I'll buy the dog. Here's $50 right now. He said, but I've got to know before I buy this dog, why are you selling a talking dog for $50? It's done all that dog back there's done. And the man said, I'll tell you why. That dog's nothing but a liar. He's never left that backyard before in his life. So, we can talk about being servants all day long, but unless we put it in practice, it doesn't matter. Just talk. Thank you very much for your time.